All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for coming to our Tariff Town Hall this morning, sponsored by Americans for Tax-Free Tuna. This morning, we're going to have two discussions on the subject of U.S.-China trade negotiations, and specifically on Section 301 tariffs. Following our second panel, we're going to take questions from the audience. Our first discussion is with an international trade expert and our special guest today, Ambassador Robert Holleyman. Ambassador Holleyman is the former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative under President Barack Obama, and he now serves as President and CEO of Crowell & Mooring International. Thank you, Ambassador Holleyman, for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to go through a few questions from the ambassador. Obviously, all eyes are focused on the current 301 China tariffs, especially in this room, and the upcoming U.S.-China meeting in Argentina. But these trade tensions didn't start overnight. Can you start us off by providing some background on how we got here and what the administration has adopted these tariff lists in the first place? Why did they do this?
Sure. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here today. I do think it's important to set some context around this. The U.S. trade disputes with China, specifically around intellectual property, go back to the early 1990s. I was in the private sector and in the George H.W. Bush administration. When Carla Hills was the USTR, we began a series of potential trade actions against China because they did not protect IP at all. That then led to threatened rounds of tariffs on two occasions in the Clinton administration that resulted in China passing, for the first time ever, IP laws that did protect IP. We then moved into an era where I think there was optimism that China would begin to play by the rules. The U.S. Worked with the global community to help bring China into the World Trade Organization with the sense that by bringing in that economy, the rules-based system would meet the evolving nature of the Chinese economy, which was expected to become more open and market-based. What's happened since that time is that while China has grown and has become a major competitor, they have not sufficiently developed into a market-driven economy. They have used their economic prowess to, in many respects, gain unfair advantage around trade. When I was in the Obama administration, we worked very actively to try to address the trade distorting practices of China, both through annual dialogues and commitments, including in areas around IP. But in our case, following on the George W. Bush administration trying to reach a bilateral investment treaty with China. I think what we now know, and we see certainly from this administration, is that the Chinese effort to secure technology advantage, to obtain IP and intellectual property in ways that are not consistent with the trade rules, has only grown over time. And the Trump administration, after an initial 6 months or so of trying to negotiate with China, recognized that what we had all tried for many years was not working. And they initiated a process under Section 301 of the U.S. trade law that looks at whether unfair practices by a trading partner have an adverse impact on the U.S. Specifically, they looked at China's strategy around building its export industries under a China Made in 2025 program were actually harming the U.S. They looked at specific issues around theft of intellectual property. They looked at issues like cyber intrusions into U.S. networks and corporate networks to gain trade secrets. And finally, they looked at the overall effort by China to force investments that were designed to extract technology from countries like from the US to try to gain an advance for China. So long answer to say that this history is important. It also helps us understand why we are where we are now.
Right, makes a lot of sense. It's been going on for a long time. So let's get into the 301.
Sure.
Obviously, we know that there's three tariff lists, and they're not identical. Can you talk a little bit about that? The list 3 in particular is currently at 10%, but they're going to move it up to 25% in the new year. They didn't create an exclusion process for list 3 as they did for the previous list. Why do you think the administration has adopted the 301 tariffs this way? Can you give us the context there?
Sure, I'll give you context. Let me say something beforehand, and this is just sort of a personal view on this. Look, I don't think, and one of the reasons why the Obama administration didn't do it, I don't think tariffs are the way to do this. I mean, tariffs, I think if you polled the American public and said, what are tariffs? People wouldn't know. They're a tax.
Right.
And so it's a trade tax. And using taxes on U.S. citizens and companies as a means of getting change in another country seems to me a really blunt tool. And it certainly is one that I think virtually everyone agrees the U.S. pays a price. But with that background, I think the thought process that the administration laid out was quite clear early on. It's less clear now. There were 2 initial lists that together put tariffs on about $50 billion worth of products coming from China into the U.S., bought by U.S. companies and consumers. That was really designed to be proportionate to the type of losses that the U.S. believed we were having occur through the 301 findings around sort of the theft of IP, the intrusions, the effort to gain by China unfair advantage over the U.S. through forced technology transfers and others. That set of tariffs, did not have the effect of resulting in China agreeing to make any substantial changes. So I think the administration, to significantly increase the stakes for China, and of course to increase the stakes on Americans, they said, we'll do tariffs on another 200, on basically another 200 billion of goods. And it's that range that is clearly just designed to exert broad pressure on China. I think every observer believes it goes beyond what the US was quantifying as the loss. But it's that for which we now have a 10% tariff on that list, with the possibility that as of January 1, it could go to 25%. And unlike the prior 2 lists, where there was a exclusion process by which companies who had were particularly hard hit, U.S. companies, might seek relief of the tariff, there hasn't been an announcement like that, an exclusion process for this last round on the $200 billion.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's probably that way for 2 reasons. One is the administration said that they wanted 10% tariffs, and then if China didn't come forward with something between then and January 1st, that they would increase them to 25%. So I think the administration was holding out the idea that they can get tougher on China, and also, i.e., tougher on the United States as part of that process. And so I'm guessing that they did not announce the exclusion process as they did for the earlier 2 lists, because they're holding that kind of in reserve. Hopefully, if they go to 25%, which I hope they do not have to do, then it should be clear that they have an exclusion process for that tariff list, just as they did for all those. It would otherwise make no sense for us to make every sector of the U.S. economy suffer for ratcheting up the pressure. But all eyes right now are on the meeting between President Trump and President Xi Jinping that will happen in Buenos Aires at the end of this week. And I think a lot of what happens at that meeting is going to also determine where we go next in the process.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that meeting for a minute. So they meet this week in Argentina. How do you expect it's going to go? And what do you think we're likely to see come out of it?
That's a great question. That is a great question.
If we knew the answer to that, we'd all be
Yeah,
here.
no, exactly. Look, there are differing schools of thought about it. I'll tell you sort of what my perspective is. One is that every time leaders of 2 countries meet, it's a forcing action that brings all the tools of their respective governments together to try to see if they can come closer to a resolution. So I think we are seeing from both the United States and China an effort to say, can we make this meeting between the two leaders a successful meeting? And so I think that really means that from both countries' perspective, they are actually trying to close the gap. The question is, can they sufficiently close the gap that the two leaders could announce, certainly unlikely an agreement, but maybe principles around a resolution? Clearly, President Trump, President Xi Jinping will not be negotiating tariff lines. I mean, there are other people who will do that. But the question will be, has China are they willing to do enough to try to correct the problems in the 301 report that were identified? And by the way, that were reemphasized last week in another report issued by the White House. So China has not changed its behavior. But I think the signals from both countries are that they know that this is an opportunity. And the White House has been signaling, certainly in the last couple of days, that they are cautiously optimistic that it can be a successful meeting. I hope that gets us out of the current morass, because the current morass is neither good for U.S.-China trade relations, certainly not good for U.S. businesses and consumers. But beyond that, other than the two leaders who are going to be in that room, I don't think we know what's going to happen.
Do you think we're going to know quickly? I mean, do you think they're going to come out of this weekend and say, here we are? Or what do you think the timing of it all is?
I think it's highly unlikely that they're going to come out and say, we have an agreement, we're moving forward, it's back to regular course of business. I think they could come out with something that says the two leaders met, they outline the nature of their differences, they believe that there is a possibility for reaching a resolution. They've asked their teams to get together over the next couple of months to come back at date certain and to determine whether or not that can be done. I think that's entirely within the realm of possibility. I think it is a possibility, but not a probability that they'll simply say they met, they agreed that there were substantial differences, and it was impossible to resolve them.
Got it. Obviously, we just had an election here, and everyone's been paying attention to that. What do you think the implications of the new Congress are on this whole situation? Where do you think that plays in?
Well, I think you get two implications of it. One is, I think there's broad support in both parties on the Hill that what has been happening with China and the U.S. is not sustainable in the long term, and that there has to be a change. I think there has been, certainly among the Republicans who have traditionally been resistant to see things like taxes imposed on trade, willingness to go along with the president, while recognizing in a very delicate balance that a lot of their major constituencies around the country were being heavy hit by this, whether it's agriculture or food or export. And so I think there was for this election, there was a willingness on the part of particularly leaders. I think of the incoming chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Chuck Grassley, and others who had a lot of concerns from their agriculture community to say, okay, let's give the president some more time to try to work this out. But that also means that this can't stay long term. Right. And I think there will be a lot of pressure on the president, the White House, say that you either need to find a way to fix this and a path to do it, or by the time we start looking at gear up for the next election, and of course that will happen, as we all know in Washington, that will happen.
It happened yesterday.
Probably happened yesterday.
Right.
People start getting nervous.
Right.
And I think they'll start saying, our companies, our exporters, our agriculture, our food producers, our consumer products cannot withstand these kind of taxes, because what we also know, and it's not a secret to anybody. I mean, these taxes are not going to result in a significant increase of these jobs being brought back to America and manufacturing America. The president knows that. Right. So he's not going to be able to point to this and say, these tariffs hurt our farmers, but we created, 25% more manufacturing jobs in the United States as a result. That won't happen. So they've got to avoid a lose-lose. Right now, there's maximum pressure on China, but that is not sustainable over the long term.
Yeah, makes sense. So looking beyond all this,
Yeah.
let's get past, the current. Where do you expect it to go? And how do you think that the tariff landscape evolves? And what does it mean, I guess, for the economy?
Sure. Look, I see one, that I think Congress will be emboldened to start being more aggressive and paying attention on whether or not these tariffs will remain in place and for how long. And I think one of the beauties of a divided party leadership in government is that they will exert some control. They clearly don't want to simply say, this is the president's responsibility, we don't really care, you just go do what you're doing. I mean, there's going to be a lot more oversight, which is a good thing, because I think it's sort of an accountability mechanism. Two, I think that the U.S. will see very quickly whether or not China is willing to start the kind of reforms that they fundamentally need to make, in which case, if they start that and there's some demonstrable progress that they're willing to do it, then it gives the U.S. the justification for backing down on the tariffs. And finally, I think that if in the worst case scenario, if the list 3 tariffs, $200 billion, escalate to 25%, then I think Congress will absolutely demand that there has to be a exclusion process that's used for that, because it's unthinkable that in the largest element, 200 billion of tariffs, that we would treat that broad swath of companies, large and small, consumer goods, food, agriculture, across the board, that we would treat them harder than we treated the underlying group of products that were specifically designed to deal with the problem we cited in China. There's the current chair of the House Ways and Means Committee has a great phrase that I love to use, and he talks about freedom to trade. And he doesn't talk about free trade, he talks about freedom to trade. And I think that really gets to the heart of this. What tariffs are taxes, and they impinge upon Americans' freedom to trade in the way in which companies, exporters want to trade. So fundamentally, I think we also know that this administration, and I think both sides of Congress, do not want to restrict Americans' freedom to trade. And I do not think they want to put large taxes on American consumers and businesses for the long term. It's completely counter to everything that we see Congress wanting to do. So I have to believe that while the administration is using its maximum pressure, it's not what I would have done, but it is an approach to try to deal with a real problem in China. But that approach has to either result in success or ultimately resolution in some way in the U.S. that works better for U.S. businesses and exporters and importers than the status quo.
Great. Well, stay tuned. I guess we'll see.
Great.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Ambassador. Really
Great to talk
appreciate you
to you.
taking the
Okay,
time
thank you very much.
much.